Boy, we've all experienced something like that at one time or another, no matter how old our children are, and to various degrees. Dick, what are several observations you see here in the Preston family?
One, I see the need to be available, but to be available in the other person's agenda, not where you're running your own agenda.
In other words, step into your children's world and always expect them to step into your
Or,
world.
in other words, don't have your own hidden agenda when you're dealing with somebody. Even the kids can do that. I think we saw the illustration of the daughter doing that. I think, second of all, is recognizing the uniqueness of each child and not comparing one against the other. I think that's so key. I think something else we saw was Dad was expressing some of his own insecurities. And as he got threatened in his role as father and head of the household, he became autocratic. At least emotionally he did.
And I think we're all tempted to do that. Well, we've been looking at building blocks. And before we go into two of the building blocks we want to look at here, I want to pose a question to Dick. There's something in a lot of articles now and from psychologists and others and theologians, you start hearing a lot of the two terms of shame and guilt. Dick, where does this fit into the family structure and the building blocks, shame and guilt?
We're hearing a lot of that now as we're learning about the disorganized, dysfunctional family. And I see where the shame has to do with the being and the guilt has to do with the doing. If I don't feel good about myself, I'm going to be ashamed about myself. And that really is a reflection probably of a broken spirit. On the other hand, if I don't like what I'm doing, or I don't have that parameter that we were talking about earlier of the authority of right and wrong, of morality, then I'm going to have a feeling of guilt. And one of the beautiful things is when we have God's parameter, we don't need to feel guilty. We can either know we are guilty or we're not guilty, and if we are guilty, we can accept His forgiveness. And as a family, we can then offer that to each other in that context.
Well, part of this now is building in a sense of self-worth in a child. And how does the first building block of acceptance, like God's unconditional acceptance of us, and then we have an acceptance with our children, how does that build in self-worth?
It's the foundation stone, but I think the expression of that foundation stone is this availability. If I say I'm accepting of somebody, but never am available in time-wise with them, that's meaningless. And that availability takes on many, many different contexts. But first of all, as I say, it's moving into their agenda. But I think one of the greatest ways that any of us can show acceptance to another human being, particularly our kids, is to listen. Because that's saying what your agenda is, what you're doing, is important to me. And that is probably one of the greatest ways of saying, I accept you. You are important to me.
And we talk about acceptance, of communicating to that child, I accept you for who you are, not for what you do. It builds into that child a sense of, gosh, I'm important. I have some worth within me. And some of the things that I've tried to do with my family is my two oldest children are pretty well straight A students. And when they get the report card, I'll try to sit down with each one of them each time, and I'll walk through it with them, and like with my son, who is 14. And I'll say, Sean, I really appreciate the effort you've done here. I appreciate you getting A's. And he always puffs up a little. And then for years with him, I've tried to attach on. But you know, Sean, if you never got an A day in your life, if you never got an A, I would love you just as much. I would accept you just as much. Now he beats me to the punch. I'll start to say that, and he'll jump in and says, I know, Dad, if I never got an A day in my life, you would love me just as much. And I say, that's right. And then he smiles and he says, but aren't you glad I got A's? Yeah. And that brings in that whole acceptance.
Let me make a comment regarding siblings. I think there's something we need to teach our children. We're all members of the human race, so we're in competition. But how do we compete? We want to teach our children to compete with each other, not against each other. If we're competing our children to compete with each other, and this begins with the siblings, then what they're doing is they're encouraging each other. This is a part of the building, appreciating and edifying. We're building them toward excellence. If we're teaching them to compete against each other, we're trying to teach perfection, and they're born losers. And this begins right with the siblings in the family.
And it starts with acceptance.